Thank you so much for joining me this morning. I'm going to talk about the Corrie Summer School, bringing Europe to the west of Scotland. Jessie Marion King and Ernest Archibald Taylor were the power couple of the Glasgow style. Throughout their time at Glasgow School of Art, Jessie won various awards in 1899 and 1900. She then exhibited all across Europe in 1901, 1902, in Budapest and Turin. Her style was famous, manufacturing for liberty in silver and all other forms of art and craft. Ernest Archibald Taylor, or I'm going to refer to him as Archie, made his name starting as an apprentice in 1893 at Wiley and Lochhead. In 1901, for the Glasgow International Exhibition, he designed the pavilion for the exhibition, which was a full interior designed in the Glasgow style. Now, this pavilion then went on and toured Europe throughout the other international exhibitions. So in his turn, he was then making himself a name throughout Europe. The couple lived in adjacent flats next door to each other at 101 St. Vincent Street. And they lived there at the start of the 20th century, from around 1900 to 1911. The couple married in 1908 and honeymooned on the Isle of Arran. Now, the two of them had different independent links to Arran, straight from the word go. Jessie, who was a child of the manse at Nickelpatrick in Bearsden, she was one of 5 children, and her father did a pulpit exchange with the parish minister of Lamlash, so she summered on the island. Whereas Ernest, or Archie sketched on Arran at the late 19th century with none other than Charles Reddy Mackintosh when he was studying at Glasgow School of Art. By 1911, the couple had moved to Paris, and they made the move to Paris. Now, this painting here, painted in 1907 by J.D. Ferguson. In the early 20th century, Paris was really an artistic haven for Scottish artists. And the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists were making a huge influence on the group of artists we now know as the Scottish colourists. By 1907, J.D. Ferguson had made his home in Paris more permanently. And later, in 1910 to 1914, was the crucial point in the Parisian Scottish artist group. And that include J.D. Ferguson, S.J. Peploe, his wife, Margaret, Archie, and Jessie M. King. While working in Paris, Ferguson became the artistic editor for Rhythm magazine, while Archie became the Parisian correspondent for the Studio magazine. So they became well-known and well-kent faces in the Parisian art scene. Now, I just think this little Pont des Arts is absolutely fantastic, with the impressionistic brushstrokes by Ferguson displaying men in their tops and tails and ladies in their hats amongst the foliage of Paris, and in the background, the buildings ahead of them. Now, this is one of my favorite works by Jessie, and it's the Luxembourg Gardens, the Carpole Fountain. I think it's a sweet little early drawing, a very tight drawing on one of her early visits to the city. Now, the Luxembourg Gardens, where this fountain is at the entrance, is right across the road from the Closerie de Lila and the Boulevard Montparnasse and the Café de Dôme, which was and is known as the absolute stomping ground of the group of artists, Scottish artists working in Paris at that time, about 1910 to 1914. You can see the little girl in her fur-trimmed dress coat pulling a little dog on wheels. Another demographic of society, albeit just a couple of generations younger, I think. Here, Jessie is very descriptive and illustrative, which is probably what she's better known for. And now in the coming slides, you will see when she gets looser and uses washes and colours. Now, in Paris, Archie and Jessie in 1912 set up their Shilling Atelier school, which had a huge draw because of Archie's link with the Studio magazine and Jessie's already international name in Europe. Students would be sent from patrons all around the world. One of the huge draws also was the fact that they did applied arts, like they had been taught at the Glasgow School of Art under Fra Newbery. In 1911, Jessie had a commission from Gowans and Gray's, The Book of Bridges, which was published that year. So she spent the summer going up and down the Seine, the river Seine, drawing the bridges in various formats, whether it be inks and washes or more illustrative works. And again, this is the same bridge, the pond is up. By 1912, the couple were looking for something to occupy their time from about May to October during the fallow months when their students had gone home for the summer. And this is when they set up their summer schools in Arran. Now, you've seen this this drawing before with the puffer in the bay and the donkey waiting to take up the luggage. What I would imagine is that once the advertisement in the studio had gone out for 75 francs, you could go and learn to draw and paint side by side with Jessie M. King and E.A. Taylor. The applications came flooding in. They had 17 applications for this Corrie summer school in 1912, and by 1915, there were hundreds. You can imagine the boat arriving with all these Edwardian students in their feathered hats and tied up boots. When they got off the boat with their carpet bags and huge amounts of luggage, they would see the dapper dandy E.A. Taylor and the witch-like Jessie M. King in her black hat and boots, waiting to load the luggage onto the donkey and take them up the hill on foot. Now, this is a lovely example of Jessie M. King, a sketch at High Corrie. And I think it's important also to say that by this time in Arran, we also had groups of artists working, and it wouldn't just be Jessie and Archie that were contributing to these students. They were very much working all together under the arms or under the wings of Jessie and Archie. So here's a lovely example of an Arran scene by E.A. Taylor, by Archie. Now, this was very much in the kind of Fauvis style alongside the Scottish colourists Peploe and Ferguson. Albeit his composition is very strong, there's something about these oils by Archie that aren't quite where his watercolours get to. It's a lovely use of kind of pastel-y palette, and he creates a great scene through his composition. This, again, is another lovely example of Cottages by the Coast, E.A. Taylor, where his composition shines through. I mean, the use of verticals and the trees against the cottages and the sky form the perfect composition, whereas his chalky palette shows the dabbling sunlight on the vegetation very, very well. However, as many of you probably will have seen much more of these watercolors by E.A. Taylor are far more successful and more seen. There's more of them around. You can see through his composition that his design, he is a designer at heart. And the use of the tree in the center, making a strong vertical through the center of the composition. But still, ink and wash, like Jesse M. King had developed into as well. Another point for Archie was that he drew all over the island, and he famously said in a 1913 studio article that if you ventured up off the roads and into the tranquil hills, one could find solidarity and one could find perfect drawing surroundings. Now, we discussed earlier that Peploe was in Paris between 1910 and 1914 with Jesse and Archie. And in 1912, he traveled to Paris, to Arran, sorry, from Paris to Arran. From his short trip, there are a couple of oil on panels. And you can see the Parisian influence on his work here, like Cézanne. But more importantly, it was an artist called Auguste Chabot, which really, really inspired him. The descriptive impasto, like Van Gogh, where he uses lines to infill the color, but also the strong black outlines like Cézanne and Chabot. I mean, the Scottish landscape had never been seen like this, and you were really bringing the avant-garde Parisian art scene to the west of Scotland. Another example, and I do apologize for this illustration, this is what you get when you ask a client to take a photo of their painting in the middle of a pandemic, a lovely blurry iPhone picture. But anyway, this second panel is what these only are the two that are known from this 1912 trip. And again, the flatness. The Scottish landscape had never been painted like this. Think of what else was being painted at the time. I mean, the monumental landscapes of Alfred de Buransky and Edwin Landseer. Think Monarch of the Glen. So for someone to paint the landscape like this was an absolute shock and rocked the artistic institutions. Another example from Peploe in 1912 is this, much more Cézanne-like, using a tried and tested composition technique of using the three verticals again, but a much softer palette and much chalkier palette. And in the background here, you can see the landscape and the horizontals used. Now, this palette is much more like the next example that I have. So when Jesse and Archie formed their Corrie summer schools from about 1911 to 1939, they traveled back to Paris in 1922 to finish off their Parisian, the Schilling Atelier school there, to wind up the business as they were getting older. That is the same year that Ferguson traveled on his Highland tour of Scotland. And this scene, A Puff of Smoke near Mogai, is very like Peploe's earlier palette, but can be linked closely to that of Cézanne. So another example, 10 years later, of how the artistic circle in Paris from 1910 to 1914 was coming over to the west of Scotland and representing the landscape of Scotland like it had never been done before. I just want to briefly talk about McLaughlin Milne, who has been covered already before. But McLaughlin Milne although he was a generation later, traveled to Paris, where his work drastically changed from similarities to his father in the previous works. He saw the light differently and depicted the south of France and Paris like no one else had before. On his return to Arran, he brought the light with him. And this is a beautiful Brodick Bay with the hills behind it. And then you can see the harbour at Corrie as well. Now, I always like to say with these ones that you can almost see the bushes move in the wind and the weather, which is fantastic. So here's another example of France and Paris influencing an artist and then bringing it back to the west of Scotland. Now, I just want to finish with these two photos of Jessie and Archie, much older. Jessie, who had an amazing career designing in Glasgow as the Glasgow Style, then working for Liberty and drawing and painting, later working in Kirkcudbright, where she lived at the Green Gate with Archie. And Archie, who started his career with Wiley and Lochhead, then moving to Paris with Jessie and back to Arran and back to Kirkcudbright. In her obituary, Jessie was written as Mrs. E.A. Taylor, which is surprising because at the time she was actually the much more commercially successful artist. However, it is their Glasgow style pieces that they are remembered for. But I'll leave this with you. Should these pair really be seen as trailblazers of the Scottish avant-garde art movement at the turn of the early 20th century? Thank you very much.